China has been committed to reform and opening up over the past 4 decades. That message was made loud and clear to the world when China's annual political season wrapped up recently in March. A number of reform and opening up measures are widely published by the Chinese side to investors and businesses all over the world. Steve Orlins, the president of the National Committee on U.S China Relations, told me that those messages are strong, but it is vital that the U.S. is on board with the momentum. Meanwhile, it is also extremely crucial that those policies are carried out well. Here's my interview with him. After the 2 sessions, as you may know, there are some kinds of consensus stronger for reform and opening up in this country. Does Washington understand that?
I think at present there is great skepticism about the continuing commitment to reform and opening. I was thinking, in fact, of the past few days are we witnessing a replay of Deng Xiaoping's Southern tour in 1992? When he went on that Southern tour and recommitted to reform and opening, the American business community didn't really believe it. They were skeptical. They thought that the 3 years before, where there was no reform and opening, had not changed. And only as China already jumped into the reform period, it took 2 or 3 years before that was recognized. The question I think that the China scholars are asking is the Liang Hui commitment to further reform and opening one which is going to be implemented or one which is not going to be implemented? So what Secretary Mnuchin and Ambassador Lighthizer are going to be discussing is what's called the enforcement mechanism. So what if China makes these promises but doesn't implement them?
There's the issue of interaction between the two sides. When Washington continues to have suspicions against Beijing's implementation capabilities, Beijing will also become skeptical about the reactions coming from Washington. So as you may know very well, there's interaction between the two sides.
Right. So we need to kind of get both sides to begin to rebuild trust, that we've seen a real deterioration in trust in the strategic side, in the diplomatic side, in the economic side. So all of these have fed upon each other, leading to a substantial increase in the level of distrust between the two sides, which is not good. We can have disagreements, but we have to have frank discussions of those disagreements and be able to then move forward on other issues while we disagree on some issues. America still has tariffs. America still has, both sides should reduce tariffs on each other's goods. That what we're doing now is, instead of reducing it, we're increasing it. Both sides are increasing it. And that's bad for the people of China, and it's bad for the people of the United States.
You know, Mr. Orlins, in the next few months, there's likely to be regulations also coming out from the United States about, for example, exports, for example, technologies in regards to what is national security and what is not. And meanwhile, CFIUS is also likely to adjust some of its relevant rules. So a lot of things that actually the U.S. could send positive signals to China, or the other way around.
Well, I think what we need to do is jointly arrive at a careful definition of national security, which does not include economic security. That what's happening is both countries are slipping into this dangerous definition where if there's a competitor in the United States or there's a competitor in China, we define this as national security and we don't allow the investment to occur. The winner is the 1/100th of 1% of the country that benefits from that. The loser is the other 99.99% of both China and the United States. I spent my life as an investor. I used to love incumbent protection. I made money.
You were sitting in a different chair.
I was sitting in a different chair. I made money. I didn't have to work as hard. The government protected my monopoly. It was great, but it wasn't necessarily good for the people. It wasn't necessarily good for the public as a whole. So I think that is not good government policy, and it's both governments that are doing this now.
But from the end of last year, I'm sure, Mr. Orlins, you have taken notice, given your experience in China, of a series of mechanisms coming from the Chinese side. But as you said at the very beginning of our interview, whether the other side will be able to be sophisticated enough and good-willed enough to understand this and also reciprocate with the right attitude for the long term? That is the question. Now, what is giving you the confidence that Washington will be able to do that?
It's to a large degree up to the Chinese government to implement policies which are in the interests of the Chinese people and will basically level the playing field for lots of different industries. Equity caps need to be ended. The restricted list needs to be narrowed. If that happens, I believe that the American business community, the American government, are going to be persuaded that this is in their interests. I can't answer the question in the short term, is that going to happen? You know, the president will make these decisions, and I don't know what decisions he's going to make. But in the long term, it's the people who are going to make these decisions, both the people of China and the people of the United States. And they're going to decide in favor of constructive, stronger relations between the United States and China.
And that's what you've been working for throughout
That's
the
what
decades.
for 40 years I've been working on it, and I'm not prepared to give it up.
But the question really is, if one party, after agreed with the terms, walked away from the agreement, which is one of the biggest concerns right now while the negotiations are going on, what would that mean for the overall relationship? Now,
it would mean a severe disruption in trade between the United States and China. It would injure China. It would injure the United States. It would injure world economic growth. It would be bad for all parties. That doesn't mean it won't happen, but I'm very clear that it will be bad for everyone in the world.
But what kinds of mechanism or safety measures, Mr. Orlins, given your knowledge of the U.S. China relations and the politics of Washington, that we could have in mind just for crisis management?
The best crisis management mechanism we have now is a meeting between President Xi and President Trump.
But as you may know, all has to be settled
delayed
before that happens.
The crisis mechanism is unfortunately just the senior leaders of both governments. But it's always been that way, that we've had difficulty over this 40 years. We've had difficulty, we've had lots of ups and downs, and it's always been up to the senior leaders of China and the senior leaders of the United States to understand that a constructive U.S. China relationship is in the interest of world peace, is in the interest of economic growth, and when there is this kind of deterioration, they insert themselves, whether it was President Carter, President Reagan, President Bush, President Clinton.
Where does your confidence come from in terms of a reasonable shaping of China-U.S. relations?
My optimism is always in the long term. Having been at this for 40 years, I've seen lots of 43 years. I've seen lots of ups and downs in the U.S. China relationship. And in the end, the problems of the world, climate change, terrorism, pandemics, and economic growth can only be confronted when there's a cooperative U.S.-China relationship, not when there's a confrontational one. And that, in the end, is what's going to drive the politics in China and the politics in the United States.
Mr. Orlins, before we go, some final questions for you. How do you think so-called people-to-people relations, despite the now geopolitics priority, will still be able to maintain its texture and its essence?
The people-to-people relationship is what's going to determine the future of the U.S.-China relationship, because in the end, the political leaders of China and the United States need to follow what the people think, and the people are going to argue for a constructive relationship, both the people of America and the people of China, because those bonds are so strong. And it's not just my friends, but it's the friends of millions of Americans and the friends of millions of Chinese, and so many Chinese who have studied in the United States and come back, and it's Americans who've studied in China and returned to the United States, that those bonds are unbreakable. They're unbreakable. And no matter what happens at the high political level, the strength of those bonds are ultimately going to prevail, and that's why I'm an optimist.
Steve Orlins, as always, a pleasure talking to you, sir. Thank you so much.
My pleasure to be here. Great
and
to
also
see
for
you.
your work. Thanks. Thanks, sir.